Welcome to the Inprint Online Reading Series. I'm Rich Levy, Executive Director of Inprint, and I am delighted to introduce Miah Arnold. Miah grew up in a house attached to the Three-Legged Dog Saloon in Mighton, Utah. She attended Carleton College and earned a PhD in Literature and Creative Writing from the University of Houston. Her stories and nonfiction have been published in the Michigan Quarterly Review, Nanofiction, Confrontation, and Painted Bride Quarterly. She has received the Inprint Donald Barthelme Award, the Inprint Diana P. Hobby Prize, and a Houston Arts Alliance Established Artists Grant. She teaches writing in Houston, where she lives with her husband, Raj Mankad, and their 2 children. She'll be reading from her debut novel, Sweet Land of Bigamy. Please welcome Miah Arnold.
Thank you, Rich. Hi, it's nice to be here at Inprint, which is the birthplace of my writing in Houston. And I'd like to thank Inprint for having me read for the series. I'm going to read a couple of different sections from Sweet Land of Bigamy, which is about a woman who marries 2 men sort of accidentally, which a friend of mine says is impossible, but if you read the book, you'll notice that it happens. I'm going to start. But I thought that today I would spend my reading introducing these 2 different men. I'm going to just introduce each of the men so you can kind of get an idea of the 2 very different characters that make up the first of this novel. The first is told from her first husband's point of view, and her first husband is a Mormon man who's about 32 years old, and his name is Larry. And I'm starting this about 2 or 3 minutes into the chapter in which he's been wandering through a blizzard in Salt Lake City, and he didn't put on a coat, he didn't put on anything, and he's freezing. Larry wandered through the streets toward the McFrugals, a 32-year-old businessman deep in the childish kind of snow thinking he rarely allowed himself. There were no cars out, no people, and when he made it down the hill to North Temple Street, he was awed by the way the street lights kept turning from green to yellow to red. Every change of color glowed on the snow below him like the harbingers of varied desolations. Foreboding red, like the world had been wiped out by war. A sickly yellow that felt like the past and the plague. And of course, green felt like extraterrestrial. All his streetlight scenarios left him the last man on earth. A thought he relished. He wasn't the type to hit the malls and play with all the toys inside. If he were left all alone, he thought maybe he'd finally sit back in front of the television and watch some movies. He'd feel safe, like anything he had to do and he'd been born to do in the world was already finished. The light evening snow had stumbled out into had slowly picked up to a full storm, and it had gotten colder, the degrees dropping. He turned around to look back at his tracks, and when he was just a couple blocks away from the McFrugals, and they were already nearly erased. He liked that, but he knew by then that he'd picked a stupid night to buy computer peripherals. He realized the McFrugals was likely to have closed early, if it had even opened at all, and he began making an alternate plan. He'd hole up inside the McDonald's on the same lot and drink the grayish hot chocolate. He wasn't a fast food kind of man, especially downtown where the restaurants were liable to be filled with the homeless whom he didn't like. He hated their apologetic smiles. The light on the McFrugals were on when he turned onto 4th South, and there were 3 cars in the parking lot in front. Lucky. But of course, when he made it his way across the parking lot, which seemed to be the only one plowed in Salt Lake City, he found the McFrugals locked. He knocked, even though he couldn't see anybody inside, and all but the store's window lights, and all the store window lights turned black at the same time. There was no avoiding the idiocy of his having wandered out into a windy blizzard with a few sweaters on and nothing else. He didn't even have gloves on, and his hands were already chapped from his shoving them into the pockets of his too tight Levi's. Just about the moment he decided to cut his losses and hightail it back home, he saw a pudgy, small figure creeping up one of the store's aisles. He was irregular enough at the store to recognize her gait. It was the teeny bopper salesgirl with a Raggedy Ann colored hair and a thick black eye paint. She had always amused and disgusted him all at once, and he had never figured out why this management let her get away with such confrontational hygiene. He watched the girl, maybe a high school senior, put a big blanket right on top of the sales counter in front of the store and lay down on top of it, gazing out the front window to the other side of where he was hunched. His feet were wet. The snow had soaked down his pants and into his boots. His walk to the store had taken half an hour, and he knew the walk home would be longer, a lot more miserable. He had even misjudged the McDonald's. The giant M loomed darkly over the parking lot, deserted. Of course, no buses were running. He was a dope, not really in danger of freezing, he thought, but in danger of being stupidly uncomfortable. Crouching down into the corner between the door and the building to rub his hands and warm up, he was most afraid a policeman would come by and mistake him for a homeless person. But of course, no cops were even out. It'd be a good night for a robbery, he thought, and he tried to get his mind off the cold by imagining the kind of criminal who waited for just this sort of storm. This train of thought was rich enough to ride all the way home, and he stood finally, only to be startled by the fat face of the punk rock clerk staring at him through the door. The condensed air on the store's window made her whole face look streaked by black lines, and she stared at him a long time after he'd regained his composure enough to stare back at her. He'd been the son of a single mother, and he was acutely aware of scaring a lone girl, which is why he hadn't knocked again when he saw she was the only person in the store. He'd realized she was snowed in, alone and vulnerable, and he probably terrified her, and so he smiled, and he saluted her, and he turned back into the parking lot, now a whole inch deeper in snow. "Are you stranded?" she asked. Larry turned to see the girl's head outside the door. He realized her face was actually smeared in black cosmetics. It hadn't been a trick of the water on the store's door. "I guess so," he said, shaking his head. It was cold. "I guess you ran your car off the road," she said. "You must be a real dumbass to think you could drive anything but a tank on a night like this. Don't you watch the news?" Her red hair was clinging to her sweater from static. She'd taken it out the usual ponytail she held it in, and she looked at him more and more like a little girl's abandoned doll. "Well, you better come in," she said. "It's fucking freezing out there. I would have shit my pants tomorrow if somebody found you outside, frozen to death, and I'd just let you do it." Although her vocabulary left something to be desired, she was right. It would be immoral of her to let him go. He felt like a jerk for putting her in this position, but he accepted what he'd done. She touched his face with fingers whose stubbed and bitten nails were covered in shipping black paint. Just as soon as he stepped in the door, "A fucking popsicle, Jesus Christ. You better go run your hands under the cold water in the bathroom. You know where that is?" He was amazed she didn't seem to realize how obvious it was she'd just been crying, that the black lines drawing to her face looked like prison bars. She was wearing a giant brown sweater and a black wool skirt and black pantyhose and army boots. He said he knew where the bathroom was, and he found it without her. Somewhere between the bathroom and the aisles of hair-leg disintegrators and hair dyes, he fell in love. That suddenly and that dumbly. Not because he was saved, but because he had found somebody who needed saving. Somebody in an obviously bad place, but who hadn't lost the ability to reach out and help a total stranger. She was righteous in the old sense. In this moment, what he had seen as pudge and fat became girlish curves, and the eyeliner was a barrier he would help her past, and the hair, the last remnant of what looked to be a tough upbringing. Though usually a person thinks the words that will one day sink their heart will be in a more poetic vein, somehow Larry Jenks realized that she'd said exactly what he'd been waiting for somebody to tell him his entire life. "I'd shit my pants if you died." It was a beautiful thing to say. Okay, so this is our introduction to Larry, her first husband. And I'll follow up with the introduction to Shakur, who is her second husband. He's a South Asian poet in the schools. And this is told from Helen's point of view, and Helen is one of the main characters in the story. Obviously, she's the one who marries two men. It was the first day she saw Shakur, where I saw what she thought was a Mexican worker sitting in the middle of a row of a dozen white plastic chairs on Main Street in Franklin, Utah, and holding up a bunch of Bush Lies, People Die signs. She thought, he's going to get killed. Nah, he'd said when she got up the courage to walk over from the counter at Marion's diner to warn him. And what made her do it? She'd never done something so forward in her life. Nah, they just scream obscenities at me and flip me off, he'd said, and grinned. A boy in a yellow Mustang zoomed past, screaming something as if on cue. And Shakur had thrown his head back and laughed. He wasn't screaming out anything himself. He wasn't even standing. The boy's idea of protest was lounging back in a cheap long chair, holding up his handmade sign, and drinking an iced tea from Marion's. Sit down, he told her, and she did. Just like that, she had changed the course of her life, which she knew now, but she didn't know then. Then it was just curiosity that held her. She'd wanted the story about this thin, bright-eyed, happy protester with the shock of shining black hair that reached out toward the world in every direction at once. On TV, activists were insane, wild-eyed, and so certain of their point of view, they looked mean. They yelled, their voices screeching the will of the mobs they faced, even when they spoke of peace. It was the primary reason she had never sought out a protest herself, though she felt sure nobody wanted the war to end as much as she did with Larry away at war. A teenage boy in a gray t-shirt and tight, worn jeans was walking by on the sidewalk between Shakur and Helen and the abandoned storefront of Irma's office necessities. His short hair and his wide, freckled face reminded Helen a lot of the guys she had grown up with, a farmer's son. But not Billy's and not hers. There was no resemblance. When this kid stopped in his tracks, Helen winced, ready for the ensuing fight. "Mr. Cha-Cha! Mr. Cha-Cha!" "Scotty," Shakur said, smiling back at the boy. Sit down, I've been thinking about you. How's your summer been?" No thanks," the boy had said, eyeing the sign in his teacher's hand. "Did you hear back from the U?" Still waiting, the boy said, looking at his boots for courage he now found. "You know, my brother's in Iraq and we're proud of him for it. It's an honor to serve." "We published the poem you wrote about that," Shakur said, nodding seriously. "I still think about it." "Yeah," the boy said. "Well, we're all proud." Helen could see the boy liked Shakur, and she was impressed that Shakur had taken the kid seriously. Impressed more, perhaps, that the kid had taken a man like Shakur seriously. This was no small feat in a city like Chipeta. Ida and Herman and a group of about 10 other people crossed the street from the empty bowling alley's parking lot. They were carrying armloads of signs and a couple of coolers. Helen thought poor Scotty might run at the side of the real hippies, but Shakur didn't even notice how he tensed up. "Your brother's trying to take care of the country," Shakur was saying, "and I want the country to take care of your brother. Your brother deserves it." "Mm-hmm," the boy said, already walking away at a swift trot. "See ya, Cha-Cha." Helen stood to go too. "But the signs just got here," Shakur cajoled. "You can hold up one of your own." That was supposed to be her moment to say, "You know, my husband's in Iraq, and I'm proud of him for it." But she didn't. She wanted to sit next to Shakur. She wanted him to smile over at her, and so she let Ida hand her a sign with bleeding and maimed, maybe dead Iraqi child on it, and the words, "A war is no place to raise a child." It offended her to the point of outrage, using the image of a child she didn't even know to make a political point. This kind of sullied, sordid sentiment embodied the reason she'd stayed away from the rallies. She immediately rolled the sign up and held it below her arm like a weapon she'd defend if someone tried to take it back. But nobody was paying attention to her. They were listening to Ida, who she knew from childhood, though Ida didn't recognize Helen yet. Today, Ida was sitting next to a woman Helen met the one day only. Her hair was bright red, and Helen was startled to see there was a baby tucked into a sling on her chest, suckling on her breast right in the middle of Main Street. It seemed monstrous to her. With one hand, she held the baby's head, it was that young, and with the other, she managed to prop up a sign whose slogan Helen couldn't see. Ida, in a dress she'd made out of an actual U.S. flag, was going on about her first husband, Rex Humphrey. He'd been the life of the party when he left for Nam, and he'd come back changed. He'd taken to sleeping with a gun beneath his pillow, no matter how no matter her protests. She stayed anyway because she was 18. She believed in duty. But then Rex got spooked by his dog in the middle of the night and shot her before he was even conscious. I love Rex, Ida said, but Bingo was his hunting dog. He'd had her since childhood. The summer before he shipped out, a man kicked her in the ribs at a baseball game, and Rex had beat that man to nothing in a blink. It took both teams to pry him off the asshole, though, of course, their efforts were only half-hearted. Everybody loved Rex. If he could shoot Bingo, though, I was next. I left him. I'd have been a fool not to have. Poor old Rex, she said, eyes welling up with tears. Shot himself in his mother's backyard a couple of years later. Herman walked over to Ida and squeezed her on the shoulders. He kissed the top of her head. You did the right thing, Ida, the redhead lady said. I just read about a man who came back with PTSD nobody could get him any help for. He stabbed his wife 50 times in her sleep. 50! 2 kids sleeping in the room over. Thank God he didn't remember them. Army tried to cover it up, of course. All in the family kind of thing. Wasn't for the internet, we wouldn't know the hell these boys and girls come back carrying inside them. Ida sighed, and Helen was disgusted. Not by Ida, but the redhead. She was just rubbed wrong, so Helen stood up to go. It's just another crime of war, the woman said. I swear to God, our family's picking up and moving to Canada if Bush was elected again. With that, a pickup truck loaded with teenagers came screeching by, and Helen was hit hard in the chest by a water balloon, liquids shooting up right into her face. Everybody scrambled around like chickens. Get the license plate, the mother was screaming into her knees. They could have killed Bradley. She was hunched down over her child, but it turned out Helen and Herman were the only people who suffered a direct hit. Everybody else's signs had deflected the attack. Foul, skunkish water permeated the entire line of protesters now, and Helen herself felt it soaking into her skin, which terrified her. She jumped up to flee, but Chakor got her wrist. She turned to him, and he was handing her a red flannel shirt. It confused her. For your face, he said. But then instead of giving it to her, he cupped her whole head in one hand and dabbed the water off her eyes and her cheeks with the other. She felt like a statue being rescued, like he was wiping away centuries of dirt. Inside his hand, she brightened. She could feel it. You'll let me take you to the grill for lunch later, he said, for having taken one for the team. She nodded yes. She blushed. She didn't say, you aren't my team. Thank you very much.